My name is Hugh Kinsey. You've heard of those deadbeat dads who go out for cigarettes and never return? That was me. I don't even smoke. I shouted behind me that I was headed out as I was leaving through the front door, stepping over a kid's toy that was in my path. That was 1985. Several hundred miles later, the engine in my 1967 Rambler Rebel started to overheat. I pulled over into a small Nebraska town looking for a gas station. I had some cash in my glove box, and I found a place to stay and some gainful employment. 3 years later, I was still there. I'd like to say I never looked back, but I have. I did. I thought about what it was like for her when she realized I wasn't coming home. I wondered how long it took for her to figure it out. A day, a week, a month. And what excuse did she make for me, to the kids? I could see little Molly, the only one old enough to wonder, asking, "Mommy, where's Daddy? When's he coming home?" I wonder now how long she made excuses before she told them, not ever. The kids were really young anyway, so they'd grown up with few or no memories of me. I'd thought it was better that way. I'm not sure marriage is natural. I'm not sure long-term relationships are either. People are notoriously unreliable, unstable, unable to follow through on the promises they make, explicit or implied. The day I left, I remember repeating to myself as I headed out of town, "Other people cannot meet my needs. I have to meet my own needs." Thing is, I had an uneventful and predictable life in that small Nebraska town. I liked it that way. I mentioned that I found a job after I ran away. I became a taxidermist's apprentice. I learned how to remake dead animals, even to recreate animals so they'd look lifelike. There was something in that kind of creative work that gave me peace. You'd think in a small town I wouldn't have had much business, but there were some knick-knack shops that took my work on consignment, and a truck stop that sold my work to truckers on their way back to their families. Nothing like an impulse buy for a kid who hasn't seen you for a while. The name of my store was Kinsey Taxidermy. I brought dead things back to life in that little strip mall. I say strip mall. It was more of a duplex of businesses. Customers who pulled up had two choices: the taxidermist or the hair salon. Betty, who ran the hair salon, told me I was her number one referral, given how many women accidentally walked in through my door thinking it was hers. Given the state of the hair on some of those women who walked through my door, I'd say Betty was a little bit in my business, too. The kind of life I brought back, though, there's the issue. Glass eyes don't see. Tanned skin doesn't feel. Maybe that's what drew me into it. I didn't have any money, but I couldn't stop myself from thinking what kind of life it would give me. Bringing back the dead, one glass eye at a time, just might, after a long, long while, restore me. I'd stopped by on my first day to talk to the owner, an old man ready to die, who loaned me a cot in the back room in exchange for my helping him around the shop. Over the course of a year, he taught me the science and art. It really is an art of taxidermy. By the year's end, he actually did die. He left a letter with the town lawyer. It read simply, "I give this shop to Hugh Kinsey. May his love for bringing dead things back to life never die." I signed a few papers, and there I was, spending my nights alternating between MTV talk shows and tapes of an adult nature. But business was steady. One guy brought in his dog, a fox terrier. I'd heard that taxidermists are reluctant to work on pets because their owners have such unrealistic expectations of how they should look. This owner wanted the youthful frolic look, a gift for his son to whom that dog had meant the world. I did not aim to disappoint. It was a good challenge, something that would keep my mind sharp. I mentioned the fox terrier because that's what I was working on when I first met Bunny. An awkward, leggy but kind of clumsy blonde who had walked into the shop. Wingy, almost frizzy, pulled back hair with a sundress that was a bit baggy for her. She lifted her sunglasses to her forehead and stared at me, the kind of look I'm used to getting. The "this is a hair salon" look that usually stops women in their tracks as they try to make some sense of what I'm doing in relation to why they are there. I told her Betty was next door before she'd even had a chance to speak. She just closed the door and asked who I was talking about. I hadn't seen her before in the 3 years I'd been in town. Maybe she was home from college, but she looked older than that. She said she was there to see the taxidermist and asked if that was me. I said yes, setting down the scissors and coming out from behind my work table. The way she talked, I figured she had a job for me. Some kind of small animal she wanted memorialized, or maybe a big black bear that her boyfriend shot. She told me that she had some questions as she began looking around at some of the animals I'd strategically placed so that people could assess my handiwork as they approached the counter. Said she'd always seen the place but had never stopped by. She began browsing silently, and I almost went back to my work table when she said, with some feeling, "It's important." I wasn't sure what she meant. I asked her what was, and she said, "My work." I smiled and said, "Bringing the dead back to life used to be something only God could do." I waited for her to smile so that I could laugh a little. I didn't want to just laugh at my own joke. The woman's face had grown more serious, though. She approached one of the animals, a raccoon I'd positioned on its back legs with its hands wrapped around a Coke can, a piece of trash it had found. She asked me why I hadn't made it stare at the can. I wasn't expecting that question, but I told her I wanted the raccoon to look startled, like someone had come upon him while he was preoccupied. It's important for the spectator to be part of the scene, I told her. As I was saying this, I'd casually closed the distance between us. She looked up at me as I finished speaking. I asked her if she wanted to touch it. She raised her hand and brushed its head with the heel of her palm. She smiled, said it was soft, and told me I did good work. I introduced myself. I would have reached out to shake her hand, but she backed away at the sound of my name. She told me her name was Bunny and turned toward another mount, another raccoon I'd put together. She pointed out that this one was different from the first. I told her she was right, that the first one was a traditional skin mount with the skin and fur stripped off, tanned, and mounted onto chicken wire, and that I'd used the real skin and fur of the animal. I was actually proud to tell this story. I told her that the second one was a recreation of an animal, but that I hadn't used any of the real animal's parts. She looked confused. I told her that sometimes people brought animals in that were so mangled that I had to get creative. She smiled at that. I told her I could fix anything, that even though the second one looked like a raccoon, the body fur was all beaver. The face was reconstructed from clay and rabbit fur. Then she smiled and asked if I'd just run out of raccoon. That put me at ease, and it was only then that I realized I'd gotten a little overexcited. I realized I liked her. She was someone like me. I took a breath to steady myself and asked her rather awkwardly why she'd come. She answered the question immediately, almost like she'd rehearsed it. Said she'd just always wanted to know how taxidermy worked, that she'd been driving by and had seen the open sign and figured she had time to stop and peek in. Her dad had once shot a small bear while out hunting, and the guy who used to own this place had mounted it for him. So, okay, that explained why I'd never seen her, but I was pretty sure I knew everyone in the town by that point. So, I thought it was worth asking who her dad was in case I knew him. Her demeanor changed immediately, like a switch had been flipped. She snapped at me, quick and defensive, saying I didn't know him and that he lived out in the country and hardly ever came to town. I'd stepped on some nerve and decided to back off, mumbling that I was sorry. I really didn't know how to redeem the moment. I looked at the floor and told her she may well be right, since I hadn't been in town all that long. I didn't know why I was talking so much, but I figured it would distract her from whatever had bothered her. So I told her about how I lived in a city once, and when some big stores came in, I lost my job, like a lot of other people. No response. I added rather unnecessarily that I just didn't want the stress of not being respected by anyone. She looked like she'd stopped listening and was looking around again as though her mind had turned to something completely different. She was staring fixedly at the recreated raccoon's face. I broke the silence, laughing about the raccoons, and joked that people will mount anything. Maybe I was making her awkwardness and mine worse, though, so I paused. I was about to give up on the conversation entirely when suddenly she burst out laughing. Apparently a delayed reaction to something I'd said. That was all the introduction I needed to Bunny. She was kind of hot in an awkward sort of way. I could have spent the whole evening with her had she stayed. I allowed myself to fantasize about that a bit, about what I'd do if she became interested in me in that way. That's probably why I stopped listening to what she was saying and didn't snap back into the conversation until I heard her voice go into a lilt. I realized she was asking more questions about the recreated raccoon, which I took as a way to transition herself into a casual departure. Then she thanked me and left. Reflecting on it later, I realized she'd asked the one question that had brought her into the store, only it didn't seem like that at the time. She wanted to know how I got the eyelids to look natural on the marble eyes. I told her the short answer was by sculpting new eyelids with air-drying clay. Why that answer would satisfy her, I didn't know at the time. After Bunny left, I felt her absence. I mean, she'd been in the store 8, maybe 10 minutes, but I felt as if she'd been with me for a long time. I figured I'd never see her again, and tried to put the image I'd created of her out of my mind with the work I was doing on the dog. The next morning I was finishing the dog when the door chime sounded again. I looked up from my work desk. It was Bunny. She was back. This time her hair was pulled back into a ponytail, and she stood in the doorway like she was used to being in the place. I remember it because it was almost expected. She shouted, "TGIF!" I returned the greeting and told her I was just finishing up work on the dog. She came over to the desk, and I thought it might not be a bad thing to involve her. I asked her to hand me the farrier's rasp. It's a grooming tool that was just out of my reach. When I reached up to take it from her, our fingers touched. She pulled back a little quickly, and the file almost dropped to the floor. I stood up a bit to catch it, and she blurted out in a moody sort of way that she couldn't find air-drying clay. I asked her where she had looked, and she said that she'd been to the nursery, figuring clay could be bought where plants are sold. I told her that she could get it from Walmart, in the crafts section. I asked what kind of project she had. She smiled, saying it was just a hobby. She asked if I could save her the trip and sell her some, since she told her family she wouldn't be long. I have to admit, I was disappointed to hear her say she had a family. That meant she had someone else to love on her. Probably a big guy, someone bigger than me. I looked on her finger for a ring. There was none, and no tan line. Okay, I thought, she means her parents. No big deal. As far as I knew, she was still available. I told her I had a bunch of buckets, but that they were kind of heavy, and I didn't mind just giving her one. I thought it wouldn't hurt to have her in my debt a bit. I walked back over and set the bucket on the work table in front of her. She looked down and saw an open VHS case to one of those videos I used to watch. It was obvious the film wasn't in it. She was staring at the cover and asked if that's how I kept myself awake at night. Suddenly I felt ashamed that I watched that stuff. I mean, to see myself reflected in her eyes like that. Before I could say anything, she snorted, laughing again, and said she didn't care. She thanked me for the bucket and picked it up with just her index finger, like it was nothing. She was stronger than she looked. Then she turned and started to walk out, and I felt I had to explain. So I went to get the door for her. Maybe I didn't have my head on straight, but it seemed she slowed her departure to let me get past her to the door. I mean, maybe she wanted to give me the benefit of an explanation, I thought. A blue 1975 Ford F-150 was parked in front. It was rusted across the hood, and the tires were worn. The long bed of the truck was empty except for 2 red gas cans, helpful to have when driving between Nebraska towns. The passenger side window was open, and she lowered the bucket into the front seat and turned to face me. She smiled and said I didn't owe her anything by way of explanation. She'd been reading my mind. Then, surprisingly, she offered to come back later and smiled at me. Not the pathetic kind of, so you're a loser smile, but a real, genuine one. I didn't know what to say. I looked at her for a moment, looked at the ground, back at her, and up at her open car window. I lit up. Here was a woman who needed help from me and wasn't afraid to ask. It's hard to convey just how much that appealed to me as someone who'd given up on other people. I latched onto the offer she'd made, suggested we have coffee at a diner a couple blocks from my shop. She agreed and even offered a time, 3 p.m. I nodded, maybe too eagerly. It was then that I noticed that her front seat was full of a bunch of what seemed to me at the time random things. Wigs, moisturizers, candles, perfumes, makeup. I think I saw false teeth. I asked her what she did for work as she was about to pull away. She laughed and said something about being a beautician for elderly women, that she'd tell me more about it over coffee if I was interested. As the truck hit the asphalt, I noticed a Playboy Bunny decal below the driver's side taillight, and she called herself Bunny. That pleased me enough that I broke into a smile. I remember in that moment, as silly as it sounds, feeling young again, strong, desirable. 3 o'clock took a long time to come around. The owner of the fox terrier came in on his lunch hour. I called him right after Bunny left to let him know his dog was ready. He was quite pleased with the work, amazed that the dog not only looked real, but looked like a younger version of itself, all in the tanning and mounting. The guy who'd left the shop to me had made sure I'd at least be good at taxidermy when he saw that I had no other marketable skills. At 2:50, I'd already closed up the shop and turned the open sign around. The coffee house was only a couple of blocks away, but I wanted to show off my Rambler a bit. I got in and drove it down to the coffee shop. Well, more like a diner, with a waitress there. No sign of Bunny's truck yet. I looked at my watch, 2:52. I wondered if I'd looked desperate, being that early. I got back in the car and sat there. I turned over the engine so it would be humming when she showed up. I turned on the radio. Elton John's Tiny Dancer. I decided I should be reading something so it didn't look like I was desperately waiting. I looked at my console. Just my wedding ring. I dropped it in there, driving away from my house all that time ago. It was silver and worth some money, but I'd never brought myself to sell it. Next to my ring was a woman's ring. My ex-wife had dropped it into the console the day before I left. "Fine," she'd said, taking it off. So, the day I drove away, the only things that were still paired from my marriage were the rings sitting together in that console all the time. She didn't respect me. Sitting there, I remember thinking that Bunny could. I picked up my ex-wife's ring and looked it over. It was still in good shape. Bunny didn't know my history. I spun the little ring in my fingers. Bunny tapped on the window. I turned off the engine and looked up at her. She complimented my Rambler. I got out and we headed into the diner. I remember thinking to myself, she's got to be into me, right? Why would she go to coffee with me if she weren't into me? Bunny chose a table in the back. There were some people in there already, but it wasn't crowded. A lot of empty tables between us and the next couple. I liked the casual atmosphere and the reality that this was looking more and more like a date. Given how hot it was, even the air vent blowing straight down on us from the ceiling above the table was nice. As soon as we sat down, she asked me what I was doing with that ring I was holding. She was moving fast, I could tell. Importantly, she'd seen the ring. The waitress had shown up and was taking our orders. I ordered a black coffee, Bunny ordered tea. After the waitress had gone, Bunny returned to the point and pressed me about the ring. I didn't know why it was important to her, but I began to hope she was thinking about me in the way I had started thinking about her. She began rubbing her eyebrow like something was agitating her. At the time, I figured it was the vent. I knew that I couldn't tell her I'd walked out on my family a few years back. That's not the way to start a relationship. So I just told her that I was a lonely man who liked to dream a little, or something like that. She said she knew what I meant and paused while the waitress set the drinks on the table. She admitted to getting lonely sometimes, too. Her eyes were already lowered. Well, that was an icebreaker of sorts, except it was followed up by a weird silence as Bunny pressed her tea bag against the side of her cup as if to get the steeping process working a little faster. A moment passed. I didn't want to be the first to say something after that. I wanted her to finish the thought. When she finally spoke, she explained that her family didn't talk to her much anymore, and that she hated when people were passive-aggressive. She rubbed her brow again with her forefinger and didn't maintain eye contact. I looked up. The vent was right above her, and the cool air was blowing directly on her. Suddenly, Bunny stood up and said with some agitation that we needed to move seats. It was loud and stern enough that a few people, including the waitress, turned and looked. As she pulled at her handbag to take it with her, a kind of green, puke-color plastic handbag, it fell open and a heavy book fell out. A history of ancient Egypt, with an image of King Tut. I scooped the book up for her, she let me, and followed her to the booth. In the few seconds that it took to move booths, I remember feeling a strong fascination for Bunny. She was awkward, even erratic, but at least she was interesting. My ex-wife was into celebrity gossip magazines. Bunny was into ancient Egypt. When we were seated, I brought up a new topic, hoping to get past her foul mood. I asked her what it was like being a beautician. She said she enjoyed it, that she worked on old ladies who couldn't leave their homes, so she had to take the products to them. I tried to joke with her a bit about old ladies and taxidermy and even mummies, saying, "What a great connection." I figured if I could turn her attention to the book, she'd open up about something of interest to her. That would be a good conversation starter, but all she said was that she liked reading about mummies and pyramids. Then she fell back to spooning around in her green tea. She then added, as I turned my attention back to the pictures in the book to help pass the awkward time, that there was a certain beauty in what the Egyptians had been able to do in bringing the dead back to life. Not in a spiritual way, she said, but in a real way, a real material way. I knew something about that and nodded. But then she said something that should have struck me as weird, had I not just wanted to maintain the connection with her. Had I just not been dazzled by the prospect of a chance to start over afresh with someone new. She became very animated about keeping people with us forever so that they never ever have to die. She pointed at an image in the book, saying that this was the way to keep someone alive forever. I nodded my head in agreement and leaned toward her a bit. I was starting to make the connection I needed, so I repeated what she'd said. I told her she was right, that this was a way to bring the dead back to life, in a real way. I'd been doing with animals what the Egyptians had done with people. Somehow I had the feeling that she felt superior to me when I pointed that out. So I just smiled. Maybe it was a stupid comparison. She looked up at me then, in a way that let me know she really needed me. I don't know how much of that was a fantasy on my part. Probably all of it in retrospect. I mean, there was a woman sitting with me in a coffee shop, willing to have a serious conversation. We didn't need the illusion of life that our jobs give to things. We were really living in the here and now. So when she asked me to help her again, I was already disposed to do so. She said she usually couldn't trust other people, which meant we were really clicking with one another. Together we could complete each other. I was certain of it. She added that the air-drying clay really worked, too. So something I told her had value. I told her I was glad to have been of help. She grimaced a little and mentioned that the clay dried too quickly. She wanted to know how to keep it soft. Well, now we were talking business, so I told her to keep the lid closed on the bucket and only use the amount she needed, keeping anything extra that was drying out in a Ziploc bag with a wet sponge inside. That seemed to cheer her up considerably, so I added that I always had more, and she was welcome to come by for it any time. So there I was, me, Hugh Kinsey, really landing it well with this woman who sought my advice and used it when I gave it to her. This was a relationship. So I didn't even blink when she told me I should come out to her place on FM 1302. Maybe a half hour out, she said. The first blue house with the closest neighbor being a mile away. Of course, my preference was to get her alone, but I didn't press the family issue since it dawned on me that she just opened up and told me where she lived. She was right, I didn't know anybody who lived way out there. Again, she was reading my mind when she said not to worry about her family, that they'd leave us alone. She just wanted me to teach her some stuff, and she wanted to show me something. I confess I started to get excited about what I thought she was offering. And I was a little impatient and didn't want to have to wait till I made it to her place to be alone with her. Her next statement brought me back to reality somewhat. She wanted to show me her models and how she was starting to experiment with that process I'd explained to her, recreation. She liked recreating, she said. I'd taught her something really useful. I admit I was completely lost in the conversation at this point, but I assumed she was sculpting something. In any case, I'd latched on to what she'd said about her family leaving us alone. So she wanted it, too. She wanted to be alone with me. She wanted to show me her work like I had shown her mine. Maybe I would give her that ring, I thought. She had the same size hands as my wife. In retrospect, I admit my fantasy for her clouded my mind a bit. Maybe it was because I'd watched so many adult films that I couldn't distinguish fantasy from reality anymore. I just thought she was on the same page as me on this one. I mean, she knew about my adult films and I knew about her Playboy bunny, and we were both totally cool with it. She looked at her watch right then and jumped up to leave, concerned about the time. After affirming I'd visit her, she surprised me by saying she'd be ready for me around 5 p.m. Then she was gone, leaving me sitting there with a half cup of coffee and a funny look on my face. I looked at my watch. It was almost 4 o'clock already. Really, that didn't give me much time. But FM 1302 wasn't so far out. What, half an hour? And however far down she was. Okay, so I have to admit what I wanted was to get physical with her. It had been a long time since I'd been with any woman. Years. And my wife about 6 months before I walked out. She couldn't make love after having a baby, she'd said. Sure, but 6 months. The reality is that she'd lost interest in me. I think I wasn't enough for her. Maybe I'd stopped trying to be because of my own frustrations. I mean, I think about it now while I'm telling this story. It wasn't so bad. Anyway, I'd made out a lot in high school, part of being good-natured and having a halfway decent bad boy kind of look. That's what girls went for back then. MTV was just out. I got my hair styled like Rod Stewart and memorized all the lyrics to She Won't Dance With Me. It worked. Then I graduated, and a year later, I was saying I do to a woman who would later disrespect and reject me. Why'd she marry me then? Just to push me away all the time. Okay, well, sitting in that diner, waiting to drop money to the waitress, it seemed like a good idea to hit the reset button on all that. new woman, new life. 5 p.m. on the dot. I stopped my car at the end of the gravel road that led up to the first blue house on FM 1302 and stepped out. The house was a 2-storied, gabled kind of thing, painted a sky blue. A peaceful-looking country home out in the middle of farmland that no one would stumble upon unless invited. I looked to my left. Bunny's truck was parked closer than I was, so she was home. She had to be inside. There was no doorbell, so I tapped on the storm door glass with my fingertips, loud enough to be heard. While I waited, I tested the handle. The door was unlocked. I stood back for a moment. No response. I opened the storm door and tapped, like before, on the wooden door behind it. Closing the storm door again, I stood back. The place was dead quiet. I opened the storm door again and tested the door handle leading into the house. It turned. I pushed and it opened. Not to scare Bunny, I called her name just loud enough to be heard. No answer. I called again, louder this time. No answer. I pushed the door open all the way. It was dark inside. Not the kind of pitch dark you'd have found at night with no lights on and unable to see your way from the door into the living area. The kind of afternoon dark you get when you come home to find that no interior lights are on, and the late afternoon sun is peeking through the windows at whatever angles the shadows of the house allow. I called out again, told her it was just me, and asked if she was home. Nothing. I stepped inside. The storm door clicked behind me. I walked across the polished wooden floor. The smell of artificial lavender hit me within a few steps. I looked around for the candle. A lit candle meant someone had to have been around to light it. I didn't want to scare Bunny if she found me standing in her parlor. I called out to her again, telling her that's where I was. Within a few more steps, my eyes found the candle, one of the big fat ones sold in one of the knick-knack stores on the main strip, one that could burn for days. The scent was stronger than just the one candle could produce. There was another one, or several, somewhere. I stepped into the dining room and looked through the window into the backyard. A child's swing set was out there, the swing moving a little in the breeze. Suddenly I felt awkward, like I wouldn't be able to explain why I was there if someone in Bunny's family suddenly appeared. But only Bunny's truck was on the long driveway, so maybe everyone else was out of the house. That meant I'd be alone with her. The thought emboldened me. Maybe she was upstairs. Maybe she wanted me to find her. Then I heard her voice shouting from above the stairwell that she was upstairs in her studio. Oh, right, I thought, her models. I started up the staircase quickly, 2 steps at a time. She was alone in the house on the same floor as the bedrooms, and she was calling me up. The scent of lavender was still present, but faint. A short hallway connected the upstairs bedrooms in either direction of the landing. A kind of closet was open, and a set of stairs was visible within it. They led up to the 3rd floor. I called her again just to be sure, and I heard her voice from the floor above me, coming out from the stairwell door. She sounded happy that I'd arrived. Her good mood was back. Well, that was good. If the mood was going to shift, I might as well ride the high tide. I playfully asked what kind of studio she had up there as I climbed the steps. And no sooner had I gotten the question out than I smelled it. That is, I knew the smell, having tanned the hides off an innumerable amount of roadkill animals that had been in the back of a truck for days before showing up at my place for mounting. Something was dead. A humming sound grew louder as I reached the landing. My eyes scanned for the source of it first. It was an electric air conditioner unit, blowing freezing cold air across the room. Bunny was sitting on the floor with her back to me, in the blast of the cool air that was striking her first. She was rubbing the feet of an old woman, sitting with her back stiff against the headboard of an old rocking chair, bathed in the light of the sun that came directly through the oval window. The solution Bunny was using smelled of formaldehyde. Before I could get the question out, Bunny explained that her grandmother had died the day before and that she needed help getting her ready. Time felt as if it had slowed down. I just stood there wondering what the hell was happening. Then I remembered all that beautician stuff in her truck and asked if she was getting her grandmother ready for burial. The words, I think, were barely audible. Bunny at first didn't respond. She just kept working away on the old woman. I took a few steps closer and noticed the stiffness in that old woman. Rigor mortis. If she had died yesterday, her head would be slumping by morning as the stiffness left her body. I put a hand on Bunny's shoulder and told her I was sorry about her grandmother, but that whatever she was doing wasn't right. I didn't know what else to say. She explained that was why she needed my help. She wanted me to help make her grandmother ready, which at the time made no sense to me. I asked if she was getting the old woman ready for the funeral parlor, and if I could help her take the old woman to a mortician. Bunny shot me a sideways glance. "No," she barked. I shook my head, telling her I was sorry, but I couldn't help. I didn't even know what she was asking me to do, but whatever it was, I knew I couldn't help. Because I knew I was going to fail at whatever Bunny wanted. I'd made up my mind that the best way to help her was to talk her out of whatever she was planning. But I stopped dead in that thought when she jumped up and turned away from the old woman. That was the first time I got a clear view of what she had done. She'd shoved a long needle, or was it a long nail? It was such a thick piece of metal, into the bottom of the old woman's foot and threaded a thick wire through the top, pulling it against a cross beam she'd set up in the ceiling. I followed the wire with my eyes from the old woman's foot up into the cross beam and noticed that 3 similar wires were descending from the other 3 parts of that beam, which was flexible enough to bob in one direction or another. A large, thick rope fell from its midpoint onto the floor into a kind of footstool. That rope was composed of the 4 wires coming together. I looked from the footstool to the cross beam and down again upon the other 3 wires. They were fastened in a similar way with a large nail through the other foot and the 2 hands, with each of those wires also cross-stitched into the wrist for support. A flick of the wire and the limbs would dance. Bunny had made a marionette. I stood there, transfixed by the scene, taking shallow breaths and frozen in place. She cackled, laughing, demanding I watch, while leaping onto a foot pedal. She then extolled the beauty of her machine. At first, just one arm flicked, and then the other. It took Bunny another leap onto the floor panel to yank the feet and ankle wires up sufficiently to stand the old woman up on her feet. Clearly, this was the first time Bunny was using this machine. The old woman shot up from the chair where she'd been stretched out in a kind of heap, fell limp a little against the strain of the wires, and then stood taut again. Standing there just a few feet from me, Bunny flicked her wrist, and the left arm of the old woman shot up like she was raising her hand to answer a question. Wire mesh in which the old woman's head was encased served to keep her head up and tilt it toward me like a bow when the knees were made to buckle and the arms spread out in a curtsy. This was uncanny. It was just like she was alive, but backlit from the oval window so I could no longer see her features. All I could clearly see through the waning light of the room was the silhouette of the old woman and the wires that commanded her movement. Another click of the pedal, and the old woman's head raised again, and she shifted towards me. Now I could see her face clearly. Scales of air-dried clay fell from her eyes. They hadn't had time to harden. I glanced from Bunny's face, which was grinning with unabashed delight, to the old woman. My face must have betrayed me as I looked with utter disgust upon this. And then, dear God, then I heard a sort of groan, and at first wondered if it were Bunny. The sound must have frightened him. I suddenly shushed Bunny and strained to hear. There it was again. This time I was certain. The groaning was coming from the old woman. Reflexively, I turned to flee. Whatever Bunny had done here, I couldn't fix. As I was about to descend the stairs, Bunny appeared in front of me. She grabbed me and spun me toward her so that we were face to face, inches apart. She told me that only I, of everyone she'd met, could understand this. She was hysterical, laughing one moment, dour the next. She was screaming at me, kept saying, "Don't you see what I see?" When it became clear to her that I couldn't, she suddenly seemed to calm herself. Her hands dropped from her head to her sides, and she took in a slow, deep breath. She told me to turn around. I did, so that I was facing down the stairs. I thought she'd given up and was about to let me go when, out of nowhere, she gave me a strong kick to the lower back, flinging me head first down a dozen steps. My head must have knocked against the first two before I blacked out. I must have hit more and the wall of the stairwell on my way down. When I woke up, I was lying on my back on the floor, and it was dark. I didn't know how long I'd been there. My shirt was off, but my pants and boots were still on. I heard Bunny humming a cheerful ditty, a soft singing and lilting voice pacing around me. It was from a Christmas carol. Do you see what I see? Do you hear what I hear? Suddenly, something fell against me and began pressing against my naked skin. The singing burst from melody into lyrics. Bunny was singing now about a child that shivers in the cold. And then she threw open the drapes, blocking a full moon, and a pale light flooded the room. I raised my torso to see better. Bunny was laughing again, quietly this time, in a more sinister way than before. I turned toward the thing that was pressing on me and jerked away as much as I was able. I must have been tied up because I could barely move. The thing looked like it had died as a child. It had been dead long enough to have rotted some. I gagged at the smell. The face looked cold, like she'd just taken it out of a freezer, not frozen, but thawing. It looked grisly in the pale light of the moon. Sunken cheeks, bruises under its eyes, stringy hair, dead for months at least. I tried to scream, but gagging stopped me. I turned and threw up. Shushing sounds came over me, like Bunny's lullaby, like she was trying to quiet her baby. I couldn't see her, though. She was a silhouette cloaked by a shadow. She was talking again, about how we were going to be together. She told me that if we were going to be together forever, then she needed me to know and love her children in the way she knew and loved them. She couldn't have me want her, but not her children. And she told me that I was just like her, that I also wanted to make this kind of beauty. Think about it, she said. We don't ever have to die. I pushed the corpse away from me and begged her to let me go. Instead of answering me, she started telling me all about how she had placed all the boys' insides into jars, just like the Egyptians did, she said. Then she clapped her hands quickly with delight, bouncing up and down on the balls of her feet. At least that's what it sounded like. I still couldn't see where she was. She squealed with delight and said that she'd put the heart in one jar, the stomach in another, and so on, so that when the dead would need them again, they'd have them handy. I felt her hand brush my forehead. There was tenderness in her touch. She insisted that I stay with her, and if it had to be in one way or another, she was prepared to keep me at all costs. After all, she explained calmly, she couldn't just let me go. No one leaves me, she said. No one leaves me. I asked about my shirt, and she said there would be some mess, and she wanted to give it back to me clean, said I could have it back when I was finished fixing the boy. A light came on, and I saw a box of tools on the floor next to the boy's body. The boy himself was stripped down, too. Whatever work she'd done on him was wretched. Half naked, I looked around for Bunny. I couldn't see her, but I knew she could see me. As I scanned the room for her, my eye caught another body, a young girl, arms and legs completely rotted, so that the skeleton was showing through in parts. In the girl's bony fingers were little plastic-looking dolls with pigtails. As I knelt there staring, I heard Bunny ask if I liked it, if I liked the work she did. Her voice was giddy. Another cackle and snort, and an offer that if I fixed the girl, too, then I could have Bunny any way I wanted. I found the voice in the screen it was hiding behind. Gaining some control of my legs again, I lunged toward the screen, but was jerked backward by the rope. I landed hard on the sharp wooden toolbox that jammed into my lower back. I screamed. I'd never felt that kind of pain. I gagged at the stench and dry heaved. My head fell to the ground. I thought I'd blacked out. And it was then that she must have realized that I was completely useless to her. She appeared from behind the screen and hovered over me, verbally abusing me, screaming and kicking my head against the box I'd landed on. Constrained though I was, I reached back with my bound hands and grabbed at it. I was grabbing at anything. Bunny kicked me in my stomach. I threw up a clot of blood. My hand settled on something sharp. She came down on top of me in a howl, and I shoved it into her. I really blacked out then. When I awoke some time later, I felt her body on top of mine. There was a viscous pool of blood and phlegm on me, and on the floor surrounding me. She was dead. Bunny was dead. I tried to pull my hand out from between us. I still had my fingers around the rasp that was now lodged in her stomach and jutting out her back, angled between her shoulder blades. I jerked my body and rolled her off. The shadows in the room started changing with the coming dawn. The dead boy was on my left, and Bunny was now dead on my right. I lifted my torso. My bound hands stuck together with Bunny's blood. The rasp. I pulled at it. It was lodged so deeply in her that it tore my fingers. I couldn't pull it out of her. I was desperate. I twisted my body toward Bunny and put my bound legs against her torso. I grabbed again at the rasp and used the leverage to rip it out of her corpse. I turned toward the little girl, and for a moment I thought I saw her head move. But it was just the light, the changing shadows in the room, like the flowers on the wallpaper. I bent over to inspect her, motionless. I began rubbing the rasp against the bindings of my legs. They were bound so tightly at the ankles. The metal scraped and raked my jeans and boots and flayed my hands. Every movement that tore at the bindings also tore into my skin until my legs finally were free. My hands were still bound, and I didn't know whether the pulley that was attached to the binds was still operational now that my legs were free. But the pulley needed Bunny. I looked at her again. I propelled my body in the other direction. In doing so, I realized I could stand and pushed myself up against the wall. It took a long time to fully push myself back up onto my feet. The weight of my body on my swollen ankles, the rasp had been sharp even through the boots. It was unforgiving. I expected at any minute to be pulled back by the pulley, but I had apparently disabled it. And then I realized that, except for my still tightly bound hands, I was free. I stepped over Bunny, over the boy, made my way past the girl sitting in the chair, and then past a crib that was the last obstacle between me and the parlor door. I didn't mean to look into the crib, but there, lying swaddled in a tiny yellow blanket as though it was used to being held, was the tiny skeleton of a child no more than 6 or 7 months old before it had died. Within its eye sockets were 2 large glass eyes that stared lidless and angry at the ceiling. I stumbled and made my way out of that room into a long, dark hallway leading past the staircase to the front door. I touched the front door handle. I could still drive, I thought, but my key? I felt in my jeans pocket. No way to reach into it with my hands bound like they were. But there was no key, just the outline of the ring I still had in my pocket. Then I remembered I'd left it in the ignition. Good, 1 break. I got the front door open. My legs were working well enough to run, and I left the house behind. Sitting in the driver's seat of my car, I didn't start it right away. I sat there in a sort of daze, contemplating it all. The baby had died first. That much was certain, almost completely bone. Then the girl, then the boy. I wondered what they had thought of their mothers carrying around a decomposing child. I wondered, when the girl was murdered, how Bunny explained to the boy his role to help preserve his sister. And then the boy was killed, and the old woman did as she was told out of fear. That old woman, Bunny said, was her grandmother. And her baby? Maybe it was when her baby died, the oldest death of all, so she killed them in reverse order. I shivered, the thought of all that. And then I froze, going backward in time. I looked back at Bunny's truck, and I looked back at the house, and I figured she had gasoline in her truck, and I thought about the many candles still lit within her house. I know that the bones would have been found in the ash from the house. I know that the coroner would have pieced it all together, and maybe they'd put 2 and 2 together and talk to the other couple in the restaurant and the waitress, and they'd discover I'd left town. One day they'll figure all that out, and they may come looking for me to find out what I knew. But if a man ever needed a new beginning after something like that, it's me. And I decided where it needed to be made. A couple of blocks from where I'm writing this is my house, my old house, and my wife and my children. And if I sit here any longer, I might just get up the courage to beg her forgiveness and see if she'll take me back.